The quorum being present, the Committee on Foreign Affairs will come to order. The committee's meeting today for consideration of H.R. 1093 to direct the Secretary of State to submit to Congress a report on implementation of the Advanced Capabilities Pillar of the Trilateral Security Partnership between Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States. H.R. 1159 to amend the Taiwan Assurance Act of 2020 to require periodic reviews and updated reports relating to the Department of State's Taiwan guidelines. H.R. 1189, Undersea Cable Control Act. H.R. 1157, Countering the PRC Malign Influence Fund Authorization Act. H.R. 1107, PRC is not a Developing Country Act. H.R. 1154, Stop Forced Organ Harvesting Act. H.R. 90, Resolution 90, demanding that the government of the People's Republic of China and the Communist Party of China immediately release Mark Swiden. H.R. 1151, Upholding Sovereignty Airspace Act. H.R. 406, Providing Appropriate Recognition and Treatment Needed to Enhance Relations with ASEAN Act. H.R. 1149, Countering Untrusted Telecommunications Abroad Act. And H.R. 1153, Deterring America's Technological Adversaries Act. The chair announces that any requests for recorded votes may be rolled, and as he may recess the committee at any point. Without objection, so ordered. Pursuant to House rules, I request that members have the opportunity to submit views for any committee report that may be produced on any of today's measures, and without objection, so ordered. I'm pleased that we'll be considering 11 China-related bills on today's markup. We must act now to stop China's aggressive behavior, whether it be in our airspace, against Taiwan and our allies, or against the Uyghurs and other minority populations. Pursuant to notice, I now call up the measures and their amendments that were circulated in advance, which without objection will be considered en bloc, and each measure is considered as read, and the amendments to each are considered as read and are agreed to. And without objection, after remarks, the committee will vote to order the measures favorably reported en bloc. The measures in the en bloc package are H.R. 1093 to direct the Secretary of State to submit to Congress a report on the implementations of the Advanced Capabilities Pillar of Trilateral Security Partnership between Australia, the UK, and the United States. H.R. 1159 to amend the Taiwan Assurance Act of 2020 to require periodic reviews and updated reports relating to the Department of State's Taiwan guidelines. H.R. 1189, Undersea Cable Control Act. H.Res. 90, demanding that the government of the People's Republic of China and the Communist Party of China immediately release Mark Swiden. H.R. 406, Providing Appropriate Recognition and Treatment Needed to Enhance Relations with ASEAN Act. And finally, H.R. 1149, Countering Untrusted Telecommunications Abroad Act. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. I introduced this bill with the ranking member Meeks to begin in this committee the important task of examining the necessary steps to deepen diplomatic cooperation as part of the Australian, UK, United States Trilateral Security Agreement known as AUKUS. AUKUS is an agreement with two pillars. The first is a nuclear-powered submarine program. The other pillar is to collaborate on high-tech research and fielding of advanced capabilities. Pillar 2 is critical to the long-term success of AUKUS because it will maintain our technological and military superiority over the Chinese as well as our allies. But this agreement will also require the export of defense and military-related technologies, a State Department responsibility. We are nearing the end of the 18-month consultation period on AUKUS, which began on September 15, 2021, and has largely been a DoD-led effort. What this bill intends to do is to bring diplomacy back into AUKUS, with the State Department leading that charge. And it will examine State Department's implementation of the International Traffic in Arms Regulations, commonly referred to as ITAR. We are facing a generational challenge from the CCP. We must bring all tools to bear in our efforts to counter Chairman Xi's attempts to disrupt the global balance of power. With the UK and Australia, our three nations have a shared strategic goal of defending the Indo-Pacific region by preserving freedom of navigation and freedom of international commerce through waterways. This agreement will uphold the international rules-based order and, most importantly, protect American interest and prosperity. We and our allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific region cannot afford to wait on Xi or other authoritarian leaders to dictate when and under what circumstances the strength of our security agreements in the Indo-Pacific are to be tested. This bill presses the State Department to act and account for our arms transfers with the UK and Australia so that we can act seamlessly now and not during a time of crisis or war. I also support the Taiwan Assurance Implementation Act. There's no question that Taiwan is under threat from the CCP. They will use any means necessary to unify, even force. Secretary Blinken acknowledged that China's plans to annex Taiwan are moving much faster under Chairman Xi. As the PRC ramps up aggression against Taiwan, the United States must ensure that we are committed to a robust and expansive relationship with Taiwan. We cannot abide by outdated guidelines or self-imposed restrictions to bolstering our political, economic, and defense ties. This bill amends the Taiwan Assurance Act of 2020 to add a more specific reporting requirement. It ensures Congress has appropriate oversight over our relationship with Taiwan, and that the State Department's engagement with Taiwan is in coordination with our current geopolitical environment. This bill also strengthens the reporting requirement in the TAA, which had bipartisan support last Congress. It also ensures that the state is approaching this relationship in a manner consistent with current U.S. foreign policy and national security goals. Lastly, I urge my colleagues to join Mr. Cloud and me in condemning the malign actions of the Chinese Communist Party upon one of our very own, Mark Sweden. Mark is a Houston resident from my home state of Texas who has been wrongfully detained by the Chinese Communist Party since 2012 for a crime he did not commit. He has not spoken to his family since 2018, and it's time to bring Mark home. In 2019, the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention looked into his case and found that factually it was impossible for him to have conducted any of the crimes charged against him. This resolution not only condemns the CCP for their brazen violation of international law, but also demands the CCP immediately release Mr. Sweden. Additionally, it calls upon the Biden administration to demand the immediate release of Mark and to hold the CCP accountable. If we are seen as a weak nation, we will be treated as such. Appeasement only invites aggression. As the CCP ramps up its hostage diplomacy, it is imperative that we demand the release of Americans in China and hold the Chinese Communist Party accountable for its blatant violation of human rights and international law. With that, I now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Meeks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I support all the measures in the en bloc and will speak on just a few of them. On H.R. 1093, as the United States looks to build on the important shared security partnerships with Australia and the United Kingdom within the AUKUS framework, I am proud to co-lead this bipartisan initiative with you, Mr. Chairman, on advanced capabilities as we engage in strategic competition, sharing our own advances in defense capabilities in a safe, secure, and regulated manner with our partners is critical to this effort, and I again thank you in working together on this particular bill. I also support H.Res. 90, which condemns the unjust and arbitrary detention of Mark Sweden by the People's Republic of China and demands his immediate release. He has been detained for over 10 years, and we need to redouble diplomatic efforts to secure his immediate release. Mr. Castro's timely bill, H.R. 406, reinforces the importance of diplomacy in our engagement in the Indo-Pacific. This measure strengthens our diplomatic ties with the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN, one of the most critical regional organizations in the Indo-Pacific region. H.R. 1149 authored by Ms. Weil, takes several steps that will promote our foreign policy interests, bolster our national security, and aid our economy. It requires the State Department to ensure it is not relying on unsafe equipment in its embassies across the world. It authorizes the State Department to provide diplomatic support for telecommunication projects and pushes the United States Trade and Development Agency to finance important telecom projects. And finally, it requires mobile network operators listed on American stock exchanges to disclose whether they have Huawei or ZTE or other unsafe equipment in their networks or make use of unsafe surveillance video equipment. And I'm also glad to support H.R. 1159 by Rep. Wagner and my friend Jerry Connolly to amend the Taiwan Assurance Act, a bill that I think that is important and again speaks to the bipartisanship of this committee. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Do any other members seek recognition on the en bloc? Ms. Wagner.
I thank you, Chairman McCall, and I want to thank Ranking Member Meeks. I'd also like to thank them both so much for working with me on H.R. 1159, the Taiwan Assurance Implementation Act, which will ensure tangible and sustained progress in the U.S.-Taiwan relationship. I'm happy to say it has been included in this en bloc package. I'd also like to sincerely thank Representative Connolly for co-leading this legislation. He is truly a respected voice of authority on this issue and a tireless champion for the U.S.-Taiwan relationship. There can be no question that U.S. support for Taiwan is not just bipartisan, but nonpartisan. And I thank the gentleman for working with me to advance the Taiwan Assurance Implementation Act. Confronting China is a once-in-a-generation challenge. To guarantee the prosperity of American communities for our children, we must defeat China's plan to replace the United States as the world's preeminent power. If we are to be successful, we cannot be ruled by fear. That means boldly standing by our friends and partners, particularly Taiwan. But for decades, the United States unilaterally restricted its engagement with Taiwan to appease China, subjecting our partners to an exhaustive set of arbitrary guidelines and checklists to avoid being the slightest chance of offending Beijing. These guidelines dictated how and where U.S. diplomats could meet their Taiwanese counterparts, what symbols Taiwanese officials could display, and who was permitted to visit each country. In 2020, Congress pushed the administration to move beyond these outdated, unnecessary restrictions by passing the Chairman's Taiwan Assurance Act. Former Secretary Pompeo moved decisively to implement this important law, declaring all self-imposed guidelines null and void, and our partners in Taiwan welcomed this unmistakable show of support, hailing the decision as an end to decades of discrimination. However, the administration has declined to continue this policy of resolute, unflinching public support. And hiding behind opacity and red tape hurts our partnership with Taiwan at a moment when we need to be standing shoulder to shoulder with our allies and our partners. Any waffling invites bullies like Xi and Putin to push the envelope. With Russia trying to change the borders of an independent and sovereign neighbor by force, and China threatening to do the same to Taiwan, the United States must not waver. The geopolitical situation surrounding Taiwan is changing rapidly. Our relationship with Taiwan must be flexible enough to meet these new challenges. Unfortunately, the State Department's classified Taiwan contact guidelines are often not conducive to a robust relationship with Taiwan, and Congress has little insight into the decision-making behind these guidelines. This Taiwan Assurance Implementation Act would reauthorize the 2020 law, strengthen its reporting requirements, and require greater transparency from the State Department. It would ensure the United States is approaching its relationship with Taiwan in a manner that deepens our relationships with democratic partners who are under threat by aggressive dictatorships. And it would ask the administration to identify opportunities to lift remaining self-imposed restrictions on engagement. I urge each of my colleagues to support this important bill and vote yes on the entire en bloc package, which I wholeheartedly support. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Do any other members seek recognition on the en bloc? Mr. Connolly is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to thank you and Mr. Meeks for a bipartisan en bloc package. And I want to thank my friend, Ms. Wagner, for her leadership on this Taiwan legislation and join her in urging our colleagues to vote for it today. The Taiwan Relations Act is unique in many ways in foreign policy for the United States in that it originated in Congress itself. It was not an executive branch initiative. It was a legislative branch initiative in response to the normalization of relations with Beijing. And it was designed to provide a very thorough, clear architecture, not always clear, sometimes ambiguous for a reason, governing our relationship with Taiwan. And to me, central to that is the ability of Taiwan to defend itself with our help. That's a promise, as you pointed out this morning, Mr. Chairman, that sometimes has been kept in the sort of in the breach and sometimes has been kept in a very slow-moving way. And that's not the right signal to send to an aggressive Xi Jinping who is moving on many, many fronts, threatening his neighbors, encroaching on territorial waters and airspace, making ludicrous claims about the entire South China Sea, engaged in kinetic or threatening to be engaged in kinetic activity on the India border, on the Vietnam border, and of course with Taiwan, across the Taiwan Strait itself. So this is the time for the United States, especially this Congress, to be very clear and very firm in reasserting our support for the right of the Taiwanese people to decide when and how and if they're going to manage their relationship with Beijing. So I welcome this legislation, proud to co-sponsor it, thank my friend from Missouri for her leadership, and urge my colleagues to support it. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Any other members seek recognition on the en bloc? Mr. Mass is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to, number one, just express my support for the en bloc package, and number two, speak about an issue that we're addressing in this en bloc package, and that is undersea communications through cable. It's something that such a huge percentage of our communications, be it financial, be it telecommunications of any sort, it is the mode of transferring that transocean. It's something that year after year we see an increasing amount of Chinese companies investing in the technology needed to bring this to fruition. The exact same Chinese Communist Party that wants to see America topple and communism on top, whether that's just for China or for Russia or for other dangerous allies that they have made, that cannot be the entities that we have to look to get the equipment, the parts, the technology that we need to be able to communicate across the globe. It's not just dangerous for the United States of America, it's irresponsible. And in this en bloc package, I'm proud to see that this is an issue that we are addressing here very directly. And in that, Mr. Chairman, I thank you for the assistance on the legislation. I thank you for the en bloc package as a whole, and I yield back to you the remainder of my time.
Thank you. Gentleman yields back. Any other members seek recognition on the en bloc? Mr. Cicilline is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think it's very clear that members of this committee on both sides of the aisle recognize that the People's Republic of China's continued economic coercion and aggression in the Indo-Pacific presents serious challenges to our national security. To meet these challenges, the United States must be prepared to confront them with American leadership, diplomacy, and investment. And that's why I strongly support Representative Castro's H.R. 406, Partner with ASEAN Act, and this en bloc package, and urge my colleagues to do the same. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN, provides a unique opportunity for the United States to expand our diplomatic architecture, strengthen our relationships, and advance our shared goals in the region. I was pleased to see the Biden administration announce the launch of 5 high-level dialogues as part of the newly established U.S.-ASEAN Comprehensive Strategic Partnership to expand engagement on issues from women's empowerment to climate and energy. The U.S.-ASEAN Comprehensive Strategic Relationship is critical to enabling the United States and ASEAN to cooperate on a number of regional issues like tackling food insecurity, improving access to clean water, expanding opportunities for women entrepreneurs, investing in sustainable infrastructure, and expanding maritime cooperation to counter illegal fishing. At a time of strategic competition between the United States and China, it is time for Congress to pass the Partner with ASEAN Act and affirm this important relationship between the United States and our Southeast Asian allies. Other major regional international organizations, such as the European Union and African Union, have been recognized under the International Organizations Immunity Act, and ASEAN deserves to be held to the same standard. I'd like to again thank Representative Castro and Young Kim for their leadership on this issue, especially during this moment of strategic competition with China. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Any other members seek recognition on the en bloc? Mr. Smith is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And like other members, I support all of the bills embedded in the en bloc, and I thank you for your leadership on all of this. I would like to speak very briefly in support of Brian Mast's bill, H.R. 1189, the Undersea Cable Control Act. My colleague from Florida, who has also just been reappointed as a member of the Congressional Executive Commission on China, which I chair, I want to offer my congratulations to him, has pinpointed another overlooked area of strategic importance, undersea cables. His legislation would eliminate the transfer of sensitive technologies to our adversaries, i.e. the People's Republic of China, that could be used to enhance their undersea cable capability and threaten another area of U.S. technological preeminence. I would also like to stress a related point, that of vulnerability of undersea cables. Cable locations are well documented, which makes them susceptible to an international attack, and one which does not require great offensive capabilities. Repair efforts demanding on location and other factors could take several weeks. Submarine cables that serve the U.S. mainland are thus potential targets in any asymmetric plan of attack by a hostile power, one for which we are completely unprepared. And who would do such a thing? Well, just last week, Chinese fishing boats, or in reality, Chinese maritime militia, under the guise of fishing boats, severed several cables in the Matsu Island, the offshore island still controlled by Taiwan, which many will recall was a crisis point in the 1950s. 2 cables were cut, the 20th time in the past 5 years that the cables have been so disrupted. It is reasonable to conclude that this is intentional sabotage, a trial run to disrupt communications at essentially a forward operating base in the defense of Taiwan, as well as to inflict hardship on the residents of the island. This is a blunt, bellicose message not only to the brave people of democratic Taiwan, but should also be one directed at us and a wake-up call. Again, I thank my friend for authoring this bill, Mr. Mast, and yield back the balance of my time.
Do any other members seek recognition on the en bloc? Mr. Lawler is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to commend you and my colleagues for putting forth this package of legislation today. As a member of both this committee and the House Financial Services Committee, we are taking on the Chinese Communist Party and the People's Republic of China very clearly and in a bipartisan way. And I think the bills that we are advancing both in this committee and the House Financial Services Committee today are bills that are long overdue and legislation that will put the United States in a strong position moving forward. It is clear that the Chinese Communist Party and the People's Republic of China are our greatest geopolitical threat. And the work that this Congress is undertaking is critical to put us in a position to be economically competitive and also to ensure our military and national security successes going forward. I think Taiwan, and I want to commend the Vice Chair, the gentlelady from Missouri, for her legislation, the Taiwan Assurance Act. I think we are moving forward with a number of pieces of legislation that is important to strengthen the relationship with Taiwan and ensure that they are protected from the naked aggression that China has engaged in recent years. And with respect to the ASEAN nations, I think moving forward, that will be a pivotal part of the world, both from the standpoint of our economic and national security perspective, but also obviously in terms of keeping China and the Chinese Communist Party in check. And so this is a great block of bills that you have put forth, Mr. Chairman, and I thank you for that, and I yield back my time.
Thank you. Any other members seek recognition on the en bloc? There being no further discussion, the committee will proceed to consider the noticed items en bloc. Pursuant to the previous order, the question occurs on the measures en bloc. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the measures considered en bloc are agreed to. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Staff is authorized to make any technical and conforming changes. Pursuant to the previous order of the committee, each measure is ordered favorably reported. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 1157, Countering the PRC Malign Influence Fund Authorization Act of 2023. The bill was circulated in advance. The clerk shall designate the bill.
H.R. 1157, a bill to provide the authorization of appropriations for the countering of People's Republic of China.
Without objection, the first reading is dispensed with. The bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. Is there any discussion on the bill? Ranking members, Mr. Meeks is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We must authorize funds for the Countering People's Republic of China's Malign Influence Fund to position USAID and the State Department for Strategic Competition with China. This should be a bipartisan bill. It is unfortunate that despite our best efforts, it isn't. We want the State Department to be laser focused on the challenges posed by the PRC. But we also need to make sure that our institutions are nimble and have the flexibility to address what is likely to going to be a constantly evolving series of challenges, and the rigid language in the bill does not provide for this flexibility. Given the amount of money this bill authorizes, it's important that we have strong bipartisan deliberation on the strategic focus and the future of this fund. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields. Is there any further discussion on the bill? There being no further discussion of the bill, the committee will move to consideration of amendments. Does any member wish to offer an amendment?
Mr. Chairman?
Ranking member, Mr. Meeks, is recognized.
I have an amendment number 15 at the desk.
Clerk shall distribute the amendment. Clerk shall report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 1157, offered by Mr. Meeks of New York. Section 2A, in the matter preceding paragraph 1, strike the dollar amount and insert $400 billion. Section 2E, in the matter preceding paragraph 1, strike shall include efforts and insert should include effort.
Without objection, further reading of the amendments dispensed with. The gentleman, ranking member, Mr. Meeks, is recognized for 5 minutes on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a simple amendment that I am offering to improve the legislation offered by my colleague, Representative Andy Barr. It increases the authorized amount for the Countering PRC Influence Fund to $400 million. My Republican colleagues are constantly telling us that we need to do more to counter China and criticize the president for not doing enough. So let's authorize this important tool with the amount requested by the administration and the amount Mr. McCall's bill last year authorized. And let's make sure our diplomats and development professionals are set up for success. The amendment also makes 2 minor edits to the bill so that our diplomats are able to be nimble in the face of an ever-evolving set of challenges posed by Beijing. I hope my colleagues on the other side of the aisle will consider this amendment seriously. With this amendment included, I would enthusiastically support the underlying bill. So I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. I oppose this amendment for the following reasons. The current year appropriations are $325 million. House Appropriations Committee has asked us not to go over that amount given larger 150 account concerns. We also need to find a cut-go for the Meeks requested increase. Do any other members seek recognition? Mr. Mass is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in opposition to the ranking member's amendment. This amendment, it attempts to weaken the strict reporting requirements in this bill, and it doesn't conform to the actual appropriations of the Countering Malign Influence Fund. This amendment, it does something important. You look at Section 2E, where it says in the matter preceding paragraph 1, it says strike shall include efforts, and insert should include efforts. And when it does that, to change that, instead of have the report include that shall, a definition of how such program or activity is relevant to the strategic competition with the People's Republic of China, it weakens this bill. The language of the amendment would decrease the specific reporting requirements to make sure that every single program funded in the Countering PRC Malign Influence Fund can show that it actually counters PRC malign influence. That's a big problem. So I urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment, and I thank the chairman for yielding me the time, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Any other members seek recognition? There being no further discussion, the question now occurs on the amendment offered by Representative Meeks. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to. Chair, ranking members recognized.
I'd like a recorded vote.
Roll call vote has been requested. Pursuant to the chair's previous announcement, this vote will be postponed. Are there any further amendments? There being no further amendments, I don't know. Yeah, I hope so. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 1107. PRC is not a Developing Country Act. The bill is circulated in advance. The clerk shall designate the bill.
H.R. 1107, a bill to direct the Secretary of State to take certain actions with respect to labeling the People's Republic of China as a developing country and for other purposes.
Without objection, first reading is to dispense with. The bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. I now recognize myself for a statement on the bill. China is not a developing country despite PRC's self-designation. The PRC is the world's second largest GDP and a top consumer exporter. It's home to more than 1/5 of the world's 500 largest companies. The PRC gets little to zero interest loans from the World Bank with a developing nation status. The PRC then turns around and uses that money to finance their Belt and Road debt trap diplomacy. This ends up holding other nations hostage or leaving them bankrupt through their malign activities to expand their footprint around the world, often raping countries of their truly developing nations of their natural resources. It allows the PRC to get almost zero interest-free loans and charge you serious interest rates to truly developing nations who then turn around into a debt trap. Eventually, the IMF comes to their need with a bailout. This is the PRC's ability to manipulate current global institutions that we have at the United Nations. For the life of me, I don't know why we allow them to continue with this developing nation status that they use to their advantage to finance their Belt and Road initiatives. And for these reasons, among many more, it allows them to compete with the United States in space and hypersonic technology. I've been a longtime proponent of ending this designation. They are no longer a developing nation as they were when they first entered the WTO and the World Bank. And for that reason, I would support this amendment or this bill. And with that, I yield back.
Would my friend yield?
And Mr. Connolly is recognized.
I thank my friend for yielding. I just want to associate myself with his remarks. I saw this bill and felt, it's about time. China has managed to become a great country, but not always through noble means. It has stolen intellectual property. It's extorted from companies that invested in it. It has intimidated its neighbors. And as you said, it has manipulated the international machinery to its advantage. China is no more a developing country today than we are. And it has benefited unfairly at the expense of others, including us, to get to a competitive position. Well, it's now the second largest economy in the world, largest military in the world, and it is more than capable of standing on its own 2 feet and competing with the rest of us on a level playing field. So I enthusiastically support the bill and associate myself with your remarks, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for yielding.
Yeah, I think the gentleman from Virginia well stated. I think we can all agree on this one. Is there any further discussion on the bill? Mr. Meeks is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I strongly support this bipartisan measure and thank Representatives Young Kim and, of course, Representative Jerry Connolly. Despite being the world's second largest economy, the People's Republic of China often enjoys, as indicated, and seeks the status of a developing country. And they do this in international treaties and organizations to gain undeserved special treatment or to avoid taking on greater global responsibilities. This bipartisan measure calls on the Secretary of State to take diplomatic action at various international organizations and treaties on which China is a member to change the PRC's status to an upper middle income, high income, or developed country. Propose the development of such mechanism if one does not exist, and prevent the PRC from gaining preferential treatment if it does have the status of a developing country. The steps this measure calls for highlight why it is so critical that the United States remain engaged and present in international organizations and treaties. It's only by engaging can we change things. As we have seen time and time again, if the United States takes our ball and goes home, China immediately fills the void and takes advantage by shaping and guiding the institutions for its own benefit. This is a good bill. It sends the right message, and I support this measure and urge my colleagues to do the same. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields. Is there any further discussion on the bill? Mr. Hill is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your leadership in this package of important bills today, particularly the ones that counter the Chinese Communist Party. I'm glad that Representative Young Kim is now also a member of the House Financial Services Committee, where she's bringing her expertise that she's demonstrating in this bill. I want to associate myself with the comments made by Mr. Connolly and you, Mr. Chairman, and say that this is a good and important measure. You know, China is deeply involved in the multilateral, at the United Nations and in the multilateral banks. And this is a way for us to send the signal that it's time for them to graduate from developing country status, and use this as a wake-up call with our friends and allies around the world to be absolutely, as Ranking Member Meeks said, engaged in the multilateral. When we cede this space, the Chinese take it. And if you have concerns about who's appointed at the World Health Organization, you ought to be involved. If you're concerned about telecommunication standards in the world, then you ought to be involved in the multilateral process. So at the World Bank, China's down to $1 billion a year credit capability, and as Chairman McCall has said, that's really like a carry trade. They get $1 billion from the World Bank, and then they're out making predatory loans around the world as the world's current largest creditor country. It just makes no financial sense whatsoever. So I think Young Kim has, with her bipartisan colleagues, including Jerry Connolly, have a bill here that we should all support, and that we should have and persuade the other G7 countries to support this kind of effort as well. And with that, I yield back to the chair.
Gentleman yields. Is there any further discussion on the bill? Mr. Smith is recognized.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank Young Kim for this very important bill regarding the ongoing labeling of the PRC as a, quote, developing country. This is smart, targeted legislation which calls upon U.S. policymakers to oppose an international organization such as the United Nations such bogus labeling. The PRC is now a wealthy nation, much of it ill-begotten, and it directs much of its wealth towards placing countries such as Sri Lanka, Uganda, and Djibouti into debt bondage, bribing and corrupting local politicians the world over as it seeks to create dependency via programs such as the Belt and Road Initiative. The PRC should not be preferenced as a developing country when the reality is that it is now an upper-income developed nation which has directed resources outward as well as militarily in order to threaten the global order. I yield back and I applaud her on her bill.
Gentleman yields. Is there any further discussion on the bill? Mr. Davidson is recognized.
Move to strike the last word. Thank you, Chairman. Thanks to our colleague, Young Kim, for introducing this bill. I applaud the effort and have personally been affected prior to coming to Congress as the owner of manufacturing companies in Ohio by China's refusal to comply with the terms of the World Trade Organization framework. They exploit the developing nation status, and this bill hopefully will correct that. I do have an amendment. I appreciate the hard work of Young Kim and her staff and the committee staff to try to get language that will make it even stiffer. The underlying bill contains a provision that would be waivable by the President. And, you know, we continue to surrender our authority, and I think it's important for us to stake claim to that and say, well, under what conditions would you be able to waive it? And if you want a waiver, why not come back to us? But nevertheless, you know, as has been highlighted, China is a net lender to countries. And frankly, when you look at a metric called the net international investment position of countries, which is, you know, what we own of the world versus what the world owns of us, for the United States, the world owns more of us than we own of them. China is the opposite. Germany is frankly in the strongest position per capita at about 32,737 per capita. But the United States is in a deficit of nearly $50,000 per capita. You know, China is in the middle of the pack in this metric, but they have a net favorable investment. So they own more of the world than the world owns of China. Now, a lot of that goes with their refusal to comply with the terms of the World Trade Organization. And the exploitation of the developing country status is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of how they're exploiting it. But I am so thankful, Chairman, that you're moving this bill early in our markup and that it's so bipartisan to confront the abuses of China, because it's been bad for America, it's been bad for our economy, it's been horrible for our middle class and the constituents we represent. And I urge all of our colleagues to support the bill.
Gentleman yields back. Is there any further discussion on the bill? Ms. Kim is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman McCall, for holding today's markup. And I am speaking in strong support of my bill, H.R. 1107. The PRC is not a developing country act. This is a legislation I introduced with my colleague, Jerry Connolly, and I thank all the members who spoke in favor of this bill. This bipartisan bill seeks to address the People's Republic of China's exploitation of its status as a developing country in treaties and international organizations. The PRC is the world's second largest economy, accounting for 18.6% of the global economy. The economy size is second only to that of the United States, which is treated as a developed or high-income country in treaties and international organizations. The PRC exploits their status as a developing country by applying for development assistance and loans from international organizations, despite spending trillions on infrastructure projects in developing countries as part of the debt trap diplomacy scheme known as the Belt and Road Program. In fact, their withdrawal of loans that should be for developing countries enables the PRC to finance the Belt and Road Program. The PRC is not a developing country act, states that it will be the policy of the United States to oppose the labeling or treatment of the PRC as a developing country in any treaty, international organization, or international agreement to which the U.S. is a party. It also directs the Secretary to seek mechanisms in international organizations to change the status of the PRC from a developing country to developed countries. This legislation will level the playing field for developing countries and hold the PRC accountable for its exploitation of development assistance and loans. So I urge my colleagues to support, and I yield the balance of my time. Thank you.
Gentlelady yields back. Is there any further discussion on the bill? There being no further discussion, let me just say I want to thank Congresswoman Kim for bringing this legislation. It's long overdue. This will force the State Department to treat the Chinese Communist Party and their government as who they really are, not a developing nation, but an economic power that must be dealt with. And I think this will get to the core of their ability to manipulate our global institutions to get interest-free loans and then turn them around to manipulate developing nations at a usurious interest rate and then take over their rare earth minerals and ports and bases and then be bailed out by the IMF. I give them an A+ for being smart and clever, but I'm glad we finally caught up to this and we're going to pass this out of committee, I hope unanimously, and get it to the floor as soon as possible. So with that, does any member wish to offer an amendment?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Mr. Davidson's recognized. And the clerk shall report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 1107, offered by Mr. Davidson of Ohio. Page 4, line 1, insert, not later than
Without
10
objection, further reading of the amendments dispensed with. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes on the amendment.
I thank the chairman, and I think, as I said earlier, the committee staff and Congresswoman Young Kim's staff for working together. This puts bounds on the administration in terms of their ability to just waive this requirement. So a lot of times we pass bills and we feel united in Congress, and they never become law because of the process for omnibus language, and it never sticks to the appropriations. And then we have laws that we're supposed to see faithfully executed by the executive branch. And they'll come and say things like we heard earlier in the hearing about the Uyghurs. And we ask about their opinions on matters, and it's like, well, at some level, while I am curious about your opinion, your job in the executive branch is to faithfully execute what we passed and becomes law. And I just, think this is such an important measure that we don't want them to just say, well, the Chinese people are going to get mad. Well, we know they're going to get mad. They've used this to their great advantage overall. And, you know, we've seen our people back home all over the country jumping up and down, hopping mad, because we're not confronting China. And in this Congress, in this moment when we're united, I would hate to give the administration an out. So while I had hoped that we could land on language that was maybe even tighter, this language does tighten it up and make it harder for the administration to waive you know, this requirement to say, you know, you are going to stop supporting China's claim that they are a developing economy. I would appreciate the thoughtful consideration of the amendment. I urge all of our colleagues to support it, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Let me just say I support this amendment. And do any other members seek recognition? There being no further discussion, the question now occurs on the amendment offered by Mr. Davidson. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Are there any further amendments? There being no further amendments, I move that the committee report H.R. 1107 as amended to the House with a favorable recommendation. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Staff is authorized to make any technical and conforming changes. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 1154, the Stop Forced Organ Harvesting Act of 2023. The bill was circulated in advance. The clerk shall designate the bill.
H.R. 1154, to combat forced organ harvesting and trafficking in persons for purposes of the removal of organs and for other purposes.
Without objection, first reading is dispensed with. The bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. Is there any discussion on the bill?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Smith, the author of the bill, is recognized.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you and Ranking Member for including it in this markup. I want to thank you for co-sponsoring it. Really deeply appreciate that. I want to thank Bill Keating as well as Kathy Manning for joining on as co-sponsors originals as well. It's a bipartisan bill, and I think it will make a difference. And special thanks to Mary Vigil, I should say, Janice Guy Guyutan, get it right, Janice? Piero Tazzi and Doug Anderson for working to get this bill ready for today. Mr. Chairman, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, which monitors trafficking in persons as well as narcotics, last year estimated that human trafficking for forced organ removal is a criminal enterprise worth between $840 million and $1.7 billion. But then they said this is a mere tip of the iceberg and called it a hidden crime. What has become apparent, however, through open source investigation and witness accounts, is that there is one country in particular, which is engaged in state-sponsored harvesting of human organs from otherwise healthy human beings on a systematic and industrial scale in absolute violation of ethics governing transplantation. That country is the People's Republic of China, under Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party. Their cruelty of murdering between 60,000 to 100,000 young victims every year, average age 28, to steal their organs is unimaginable. In May of last year, I chaired a chilling, eye-opening hearing at the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission entitled Forced Organ Harvesting in China, Examining the Evidence. Ethan Gutman, Senior Research Fellow in China Studies for the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, testified that 25,000 to 50,000 camp detainees are being harvested every year. 28-year-olds, he goes on to say, from Xinjiang camps can be theoretically harvested for 2 or 3 organs. That's up to 150,000 organs just from the Uyghurs. The Kilgore-Mattis-Gutman report of 2016 estimated China's total transplant volume at 60,000 to 100,000 annually. Religious dissidents targeted for harvesting include Falun Gong practitioners whose peaceful meditation and exercise practices, unfortunately, make their organs desirable. They're very healthy people, so they're targeted. They have been declared by the Chinese Communist Party an evil cult and thus fit for butchering. Uyghurs and other Central Asians in concentration camps in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region are targeted as well. Indeed, we even know the ideal age, like I've said, for harvesting is 28 years old. This has been deemed the peak of organ ripeness by the Chinese medical establishment, and young Uyghurs are subjected to comprehensive blood tests to find a cross-match for organ recipients. Sifting through the evidence as an independent body called the International Tribunal, sitting in London, has concluded, and I quote him, forced organ harvesting has been committed for years throughout China on a significant scale, and that Falun Gong practitioners have been one and probably the main source of organ supply. And the evidence, Mr. Chairman, as you know, has been in plain sight. We also know that through open source Chinese language media, that elderly, high-ranking Chinese Communist Party officials have received replacement organs from the very people they despise and oppress, like the Falun Gong, like the Uyghurs, at the People's Liberation Army Hospital 301 located in Beijing. While this shocks me, and it should shock all of us, and I know it does, I can't say it surprises me. Almost 25 years ago, and Doug Anderson remembers this so well because he was on our subcommittee, I chaired the first human rights hearing with a Chinese security official who testified that he and his other security agents were executing prisoners with doctors, of course, there and ambulances to harvest their organs for transplantation. But it was done then on a very small scale. Now it is massive. And of course, the victims, it is an unconscionable abuse of victims. Indeed, at the last hearing, we actually had a doctor who testified how he had performed one such surgery on a victim, a botched execution, who as he began cutting, discovered that he was in state of shock, that is to say the victim, a live vivisection on a living human being. To combat these heinous and inhumane practices, we've introduced H.R. 1154, and what it does, it amends the Foreign Assistance Act of 1961 to require reports on forced organ harvesting and trafficking in persons for purposes of the removal of organs in foreign countries. Secondly, it imposes sanctions on any person. The President determines funds, sponsors, or otherwise facilitates forced organ harvesting or trafficking in persons for the purpose of removing their organs. And its sanctions, those sanctions include blocking and prohibiting all transactions in property and interests in property and making that person inadmissible to the United States and ineligible to receive a visa. This is a start. I hope the committee will support it robustly. Yield back.
Gentleman yields. Is there any further discussion on the bill? There being no further discussion of the bill, the committee will move to consideration of amendments. Does any member wish to offer an amendment? There being no amendments, let me first just say I want to thank the gentleman for bringing this long overdue bill. You've been a champion of human rights for many, many years in the Congress, and I can't think of anything more horrific or more barbaric than this practice that the Chinese Communist Party engages in, to hold people down against their will and sometimes anesthetize them, sometimes not, and take out their very vital organs and then sell them for hundreds of thousands of dollars. It is absolutely disgusting to me. And I want to thank you again for bringing this not only to the committee's attention, but to the American people who may not understand what type of nation we're dealing with, and how complete disregard for human life and human rights that the Communist Chinese Party has. There being no amendments, I move that committee report H.R. 1154 to the House with a favorable recommendation. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Staff is authorized to make any technical and conforming changes. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 1153, Deterring America's Technological Adversaries Act. The bill was circulated in advance. The clerk shall designate the bill.
H.R. 1153, a bill to provide a clarification of non-applicability applicability.
Without objection, first reading is dispensed with. The bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. While the nation looked at the sky in disbelief as a spy balloon from Chinese Communist Party's military traversed the continental U.S., gathering sensitive data and sending it back to the mothership in Beijing, many Americans do not realize one data in their pockets. Of course, I'm referring to the social media app called TikTok. It is no secret that TikTok is beholden to the CCP. In fact, President Biden, his national security officials, have been sounding the alarm over the last 3 months. Biden's FBI director said that TikTok's parent company is, quote, controlled by the Chinese government, end of quotes. President Biden's director of national intelligence explained that the PRC is, quote, collecting foreign data to then use it to target audiences for information campaigns, end of quote. And Biden's own deputy attorney general said, quote, I don't use TikTok, and I would not advise anyone else to. And we just heard today from one of our witnesses, our Undersecretary for the Bureau of Industry and Security, stating that TikTok was a threat to the national security of Americans in the United States. The United States Congress, literally the people in this room, agreed that TikTok is so dangerous that we banned its use on federal government devices. And it's not only Congress. More than 30 states have banned TikTok from state-issued devices, including my home state of Texas. So why is Congress and the majority of states blocking access to TikTok? We've all seen what the PRC does with this type of data against its own people: interrogations, imprisonment, and shipping minority groups to genocide camps. TikTok is a modern-day Trojan horse of the CCP used to surveil and exploit Americans' personal information. This legislation is the first step in protecting Americans against subversive data collection. Currently, the courts have questioned the administration's authority to sanction TikTok. My bill empowers the administration to ban TikTok or any other software application that threatens U.S. national security. And make no mistake, TikTok is a national security threat. It allows the CCP to manipulate and monitor its users while it gobbles up Americans' data to be used for their malign activities. Anyone with TikTok downloaded on their device has given the CCP permission and a backdoor to all their personal information. In other words, it's a spy balloon in your phone. And I have no doubt the PRC will look to weaponize this intelligence as they seek to upend the global balance of power in this great generational competition. It is time to act. This is an issue that affects all Americans, and it's time we put an end to the hostile efforts of the CCP to exploit Americans and their personal privacy. And I urge my colleagues to support this bill as we did impose this on all members of Congress. Is there any further discussion on the bill? The ranking member, Mr. Meeks, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I oppose this measure. And I do so actually regretfully, given that I strongly prefer when you and I work together and able to figure and work something out collectively. But on this, I forcefully and unequivocally oppose. And that's because I think that this legislation would damage our allegiances across the globe, bring more countries into China's sphere, destroy jobs here in the United States, and undercut core American values of free speech and free enterprise. These ills are not just bad policy, they would actively undermine our national security. The legislation before us today is unvetted, and dangerously overbroad. It applies mandatory sanctions to companies that have independent American subsidiaries without giving any consideration to the consequences. What would happen to these subsidiaries? The bill does not say. The bill would impose sanctions on companies with a combined market capitalization of over $1 trillion, while explicitly refusing to authorize 1 penny to the agencies that oversee sanctions enforcement. How will the government handle enormous new responsibilities with no additional resources? The bill does not say. The Data Act will also result in sanctions on individuals and companies in allied and partner nations around the globe. Now, Mr. McCall, Chairman McCall, to his credit, was ahead of the curve in Washington, D.C. about the importance of semiconductors. He fiercely believes, and correctly so in my view, that semiconductor manufacturing and supply chains are crucial to national security. But the TSMC, Samsung, SK Hynix all make significant revenue selling chips for Chinese companies that would be sanctioned by this bill. Under the secondary sanctions set forth in this legislation, this means each of these Taiwanese and Korean entities would be subject to mandatory sanctions. How does it make sense to sanction the very companies the executive branch and bipartisan members of this committee are actively courting to build fabs in the United States? The bill does not say. A different approach is and was possible. We could have held hearings before the markup and carefully crafted bipartisan legislation together. Instead, my staff and I received the text of this legislation a little over a week ago, and have only had several days to review a bill that would dramatically rewrite the rules-based international economic order. We specifically offered the chairman and his team a detailed outline of the scope of legislation we could accept under this significant time crunch, but ultimately, they were not amenable to that proposal. Even though this measure was noticed just a few days ago, and the text of the bill is still available on Congress's official legislative website, companies, countries, and civil society groups have already reached out expressing concern about the scope and soundness of the legislation before us today. I believe my amendment and the nature of a substitute is the correct path that we must take. It will address the original stated scope of this bill, real and genuine privacy concerns related to TikTok, without causing more problems than it corrects. But if my substitute amendment is not adopted, I must oppose this legislation and urge all of my colleagues to do the same. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Jill yields back. Is there any further discussion on the bill? Ms. Wagner's recognized.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I support the United States of America, and not just us, but also for all private citizens. The intelligence collected from American citizens through these programs supports the development of TikTok. CCP data espionage empowers the abusive, as I said, Chinese, pardon me, lost my place here. It absolutely empowers the abusive Chinese government to reach ever deeper into the lives of its own citizens, especially Uyghurs, Tibetans, Christians, and dissidents. The U.S. should not be complicit in these abhorrent practices, and I support the chairman's bill to protect the privacy of American citizens and attack the CCP's mass surveillance systems, and I yield back.
Jill Lee yields back. Is there any further discussion on the bill? Mr. Stanton is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Data privacy is national security, and the U.S. government should take seriously any attempts by foreign governments or foreign-owned corporations to gather unlimited data on U.S. citizens. But the Data Act, in its current form, is a poor way to accomplish that goal. We are being asked to rush this bill through committee with no input from sanctions experts, technologists, the business community, or even the regulatory agencies who would be in charge of enforcing the ban. And I expect that they would have a lot of valuable feedback. The sanctions in this bill are extremely wide-ranging, with an unknown impact on other businesses operating in the United States, not to mention the real constitutional and legal questions this bill raises. If we want to get serious about protecting the data privacy of millions of Americans, about our national security in the 21st century, then this deserves close study and open dialogue, neither of which have happened. For that reason, I urge my colleagues to vote no. Let's do this correctly.
Any further discussions on the bill? Mr. Cicilline is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm wondering, Mr. Chairman, if you'd yield to a question. As I read the bill, I have some of the very same concerns that the ranking member and Mr. Stanton just raised. Requires the imposition of sanctions. So I think when you think about the unintended consequences, there aren't provisions that allow the president or the administration not to impose them. So I think we have to be particularly careful here. And what I'm particularly unclear about is on page 12 of the bill, it requires the imposition of sanctions if it's reasonably believed to have facilitated or may be facilitating or contributing to China's, and it lists a number of things, military, intelligence, espionage, censorship activities, all those sound reasonable to me. But Roman numeral 4 says, control or use of recommendation algorithms that are capable of manipulating content. There's no definition in the legislation of what recommendation algorithms are. So we are requiring the imposition of sanctions against an organization that facilitates or may be facilitating or may be contributing to China's use of something called platforms to relentlessly collect data, even here in America. But I think the dangers are particularly obvious with respect to the Communist Party of China. But this particular provision with recommendation algorithms, I have no idea what that means. And if we're requiring the imposition of sanctions, we ought to have a clear understanding, at least, of what that means. So I don't know if someone can answer that.
Sure, and gentleman yield?
Oh, of course.
Yeah. The algorithms are manipulated by the PRC to send messages of influence, typically political messages on devices where TikTok has been downloaded as an app. This bill applies to PRC owned and facilitated use of this data with respect to military intelligence, espionage, or weapons proliferation activities. I think that's very clear. With respect to the fact this hasn't been discussed in the past, we discussed this on the EAGLE Act the last Congress, as I recall. We've had a lot of discussion and debate on this. Why are we talking about this?
Mr. Chairman, if I just ask, I don't, my question is not about military intelligence or espionage. I get that. If you go down 4 more lines, Roman numeral 4, it says, control or use of recommendation algorithms that are capable of manipulating content. What does that mean? Because recommendation algorithms is not a term of art. It's not defined in the bill. And again, this is requiring the imposition of sanctions if it's reasonably believed or that may be facilitating not just the items you mentioned, but also this item, control or use of recommendation algorithms that are capable of manipulating content. That, I don't even know what that is. And so before you're asking us to vote to require the imposition of sanctions on that might reach a number of different companies, it seems to me you ought to have an understanding of what's the attempt here. What is that language intending to require us, or require the administration to impose sanctions on it?
This particular, you're talking about Clause 4, was actually brought to our attention by President Biden's national security team, that these algorithms, recommendations are being manipulated by the PRC to send messages to particularly most TikTok users or younger generation to influence them and to influence their political affiliation and to gain influence to favor the PRC.
Yeah.
Again, why is this being brought up? Because the prior administration tried to ban it 3 times. The courts considered that ban and said that the president did not have legal authority to do so. All I'm trying to do is create a constitutional framework through which the president, and we don't have permissive language, you're correct in that, it is mandatory, that the president would sanction companies that fall within this definition that deal with military intelligence, espionage, weapons proliferation.
Well, I thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would just say that I think what's most disappointing about this is I think there is broad and maybe universal support on this committee to do exactly what this bill attempts to do. But this is incredibly important that it be done right and that it be done well. And I think we all have confidence that if Mr. Meeks and you had the opportunity to work in this in a serious way, we would come up with a bill that would earn the votes of every single person in this committee. I'm not sure why we are being asked to sort of jam through what I think, with all due respect, is not well-written, doesn't have definitions about critical components. We all want very much to give the administration the tools that it needs, but in its current form, without a lot of amplification and a lot of definitions, it's difficult for me to support this, and I yield back.
Is there any further discussion on the bill? Mr. Mast is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I yield to my colleague, Ms. Wagner.
I thank my good friend and colleague from Florida for yielding. And I'd like to address, Mr. Chairman, this myth that somehow this bill is vague or overbroad. The sanctions clearly apply only to companies under CCP control and facilitating transfers of sensitive personal data to the CCP's military, espionage, influence operations, et cetera. I can also say that a national security waiver lets the executive branch decide the scope of actions preventing overbroad use. And lastly, I'd say it has a 5-year sunset, which means Congress retains a check whether to extend the sanction authority or not. And I'd also say that this is an urgent issue, a supreme national security risk. The Biden national security officials, including the head of this administration's CIA and FBI, are ringing alarm bells about TikTok and revealing extreme urgency. So I think there is clear and present danger. The timing and the urgency are necessary. I thank the gentleman for yielding. I don't know if the chair would like additional time or not. I yield back to the gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Ms. Wagner. And I would just say I take the opportunity to thank the staff, both majority and minority, that worked together on this legislation all the way back into February, looking at this, looking at issues that the FBI, the CIA had been bringing up on this very issue, and what was brought up even long before that in the EAGLE Act. So there was work done bipartisanly across committee, and I want to thank all the staff for their work on that. And Mr. Chairman, I yield you the remainder of my time.
Gentleman yields. Any other further discussion on the bill? Ms. Kamlager, Dev.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and to our ranking member, Mr. Meeks. I want to speak to this bill. I am strongly opposed to this ill-conceived and hastily drafted piece of legislation which could decimate U.S. companies at no benefit to U.S. national security and has concerning implications for Americans' right to freedom of expression. I do believe, until this is worked out more clearly, that we should oppose this precipitous legislation. To me, this bill is clear evidence of an attempt to use a hot-button issue to jump into the spotlight with no regard for the actual policy impact. For one, the bill tries to bypass a review of the Biden administration's foremost experts on the topic, both CFIUS and the Commerce Department, which is drafting a strategy to address the implications of foreign-owned applications. And anyone who cares about protecting national security, and I know that's all of us, and not just scoring political points, would allow the experts to fully analyze every single angle of this issue and recommend the best course of action. Even more concerning are the bill's vague definitions, and they are, under which American companies with no real connection to the PRC's malign influence could conceivably be banned from doing business in the United States. And I'm concerned about this because of all of the entertainment companies that are in my district who could become collateral damage as a result of this ill-constructed bill. And given that their work in the arts is a key avenue for Americans' freedom of expression, I can also see concerning implications for the protection of civil liberties in this country. Clearly, this bill would have serious ramifications
That you said would be affected.
Well, I have an amendment here because, for example, there are video gaming industries that are in my district that could become collateral damage. They have nothing to do with national security, but they are owned. They are Chinese-owned companies, and so they could conceivably be banned.
Could you tell me which ones so I could go look at this further?
I can certainly make sure that you get that information.
Thank you.
Is there any further discussion on the bill? There being no further discussion, committee will move to consideration of amendments. Does any member wish to offer an amendment?
Chairman,
Mr. Meeks is recognized.
I have an amendment number 16 at the desk.
Clerk shall report the bill. Amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 1153, offered by Mr. Meeks of New York. Strike all after the enacting clause and insert.
Without objection,
following.
further reading of the amendments dispensed with. Amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Based on our conversations, I was really expecting your legislation to focus more narrowly on TikTok rather than the entire Chinese economy. And with due respect, I believe that H.R. 1153 bites off more than it can chew, as I laid out in my comments on the underlying measure. And I'm offering this A&S amendment because I want to lay out a roadmap for a pragmatic approach to address the challenges that arise from TikTok's popularity. Let me be clear on this. I believe concerns about TikTok by the United States government and our allies are justified. And I supported the restrictions of TikTok on government devices, and I'm glad that the European Union and Canada have quickly followed us in this prudent step. More needs to be done as well. Americans' sensitive data should not be going to ByteDance's Beijing headquarters. Stories about TikTok employees using locational data to spy on journalists is entirely unacceptable. Whatever action the United States government takes, American values, which we must never yield on, in mind. For years, the PRC has banned American internet companies from operating in China on baseless national security concerns. The CCP forced out Google, one of the largest companies in the world, out of fear that their citizens could search for accurate information. Now, Chinese exchange students cannot even use their Gmail when they go home for summer break. So we should not blatantly imitate the PRC's censorship policies. More Americans use the TikTok app than citizens from any other country in the world. 6 of the 7 most followed accounts in the world are Americans. We should not dismiss the soft power that comes with the American way of life being broadcast all over the world. If our national security mandates more dramatic action, I don't oppose our taking it. But we cannot act rashly without consideration of the very real soft power, free speech, and economic consequences of a ban. My amendment lays out an alternative path. First, it asks the administration to decide if TikTok should be sanctioned under current law, be it the Global Magnitsky Act or the recently passed intellectual property violator sanctions legislation, which I was proud to get done last Congress. Second, I want to allow the CIFERS process to play out. The executive branch is working on a negotiated compromise with TikTok as we speak. And as I understand it, more drastic forced divestment options remain on the table if TikTok fails to demonstrate that it can keep American data safe. But we should not preempt this careful interagency process that I am confident will produce a result. Finally, my ANS comes with a real deterrent. Once a negotiated agreement was to develop privacy legislation that will keep Americans' data secure from the PRC's draconian national security law. We need to address TikTok, and this amendment, in the nature of a substitute, is a fine place to start. So I urge bipartisan support for my ANS, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields. I oppose this amendment. Let me just first say that we have had discussions with the minority staff since all the month of February. We asked for edits, never saw anything of substance. I raised an amendment at the Eagle Act in 2021. Everybody knows what TikTok is. If it's too dangerous to be on our phones as members of Congress, in my judgment, it's too dangerous to be on our children's phones. And that's the whole point of this bill. It's also the point of this bill to give the administration a constitutional framework within which to ban TikTok if it believes it's in the national security interest of the United States. It also mandates sanctions on companies engaged in espionage and involved with the military, the Chinese PLA. This was done after consultation with many legal experts, including many national security advisors within the Biden administration, many of whom have said, as I've mentioned before, that TikTok is a threat to our national security. I've met with many cabinet officials on this subject as well, and I will hold their conversations private. Suffice it to say, the ODNI, the FBI director, the CIA director, all believe that this is a threat, a backdoor into our children's phones, a spy balloon into their phones. I've heard this over and over again. I believe the time to act is now. And I do not agree with the comments that somehow this is political or that any way this was brought in haste. We've been in discussions with the minority for a month on the language of this bill. We do have mandatory language that it needs to address the threat of TikTok. I'm talking about the amendment in the nature of a substitute. My good friend, Mr. Meeks. I always like to work in a bipartisan fashion, and most of you who know me, including the ranking member, know that that is my style. But the time has come to protect our children from the PRC, from the Chinese Communist Party putting a back door in their phones. Unwittingly, I might add, not knowing what the PRC is collecting when they get the keystrokes to what they are typing, when they get the data that's on their phone, when they push campaigns coming out of the PRC to influence their thinking, when they're addicted to this app, not knowing that it's allowing one of our major foreign adversaries, I would argue probably the biggest foreign adversary we have right now, access into their data. Passwords, privacy. Partisan bill, Mr. Ranking Member. And you and I are often in a bipartisan manner working together to do the right thing for the American people. But I want to rise above politics and do what's right for the American people, and most importantly, our children. And this young generation who may not understand what unwittingly they're doing by downloading this app. So there has to be a better way. This bill, unlike others introduced, provides the constitutional legal framework to move forward to authorize the President of the United States, within his discretion, looking at our national security, the question whether to ban TikTok, as so many states have done, as Congress has already done amongst ourselves. How can we ban TikTok among ourselves and not ban it for our children? Again, I ask that question. That is the moral question of today in our time. So let's talk about what's real here and what's not. This is a protection of privacy. It's a protection from a foreign adversary. It's a protection of our children. And for that reason, I oppose this amendment.
Will the chair yield?
The chair recognizes Ms. Wagner.
I appreciate that. I'd like to speak to the ranking members. I'm going to call it a myth that Congress should somehow delay action until negotiations between TikTok and CFIUS end. Let's be clear. The negotiations between TikTok and CFIUS have no deadline, and TikTok has no requirement to reach an agreement. TikTok has no incentive to reach an agreement because U.S. courts have indeed questioned the executive branch's authority to restrict its operations. The bill does not preempt or foreclose an agreement with CFIUS. Instead, it gives the executive branch authority to act at any time, including a violation of any potential agreement between companies like TikTok and the U.S. government. I couldn't agree more with our chairman, Mr. McCall, that Congress must act to allow a ban on companies like TikTok to occur. Otherwise, this malign influence tool of the CCP will continue to operate as a threat to our children, a threat to our national security, a threat, I think, to our very way of life. So I thank the chair for yielding, and I yield back the remainder of my time.
General Lay yields. Members seek recognition on this amendment. Mr. Stanton is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'll yield my time to the Ranking Member Meeks.
Thank you. And I want to say to the chair, and generally we do, and we, this is a rare where we have complete disagreement. When I recall with the Eagle Act, we had language, we laid out the language, we sat in offices, we went through the bill thoroughly, not just staff, but you and I, in trying to get something done. From what I'm told, the first time that my staff saw the bill, that's not trying to come up to something where we can really work on something that's important. And to say that we have to do it now and then utilize fear to try to pass a bill. Fear. Now, I've been in Congress now 25 years. I've seen that tactic utilized before. Fear that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction without evidence or proof. We should not be making judgments based upon fear. We should not be making judgments based upon speculation, especially when we have a process going in place with CFIUS to determine what the facts are. This is far too serious for us to make a decision by fear and be wrong. It what puts us in trouble with our allies and moving forward. There's no need to rush this. We could have hearings and discuss this, and witnesses, and experts, so that we can make sure that the world sees that the United States moves in a direction of making sure that we act on facts, not fear. So, in my mind, we should get it right. This process that's in work, that's in progress now to be completed. There's no need to rush it. Let's get it right. My ANS hopes us It focuses on what is in need right now. It gives us the flexibility to make sure that we move further, show that they do. And it gives us the opportunity to, again, show the world that the values of the United States, the principles of the United States, and that we tell others we live by, and not following the arbitrary ways of the PRC as they've done to some of our companies, as I enunciated as an example with Google. We can do this the right way. With that, I yield back my time to Mr. Stanton. Yield back Mr. Stanton's time.
Thank you, Ranking Member Meeks. I will yield back the remainder of the time to the chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Any further discussion on the amendment? Let me say, we often work together. I brought this up as an amendment to the Eagle Act. Our staff has been working for the month of February. They saw the text here right on the 17th. It's unfortunate we didn't get a lot of response. The CFIUS, all I heard back was that we'll let CFIUS write itself out. I don't know how long that's going to take to allow CFIUS to make a determination. And what this bill does is it authorizes the president. It actually gives him authority that the prior president administration did not have. So that if CFIUS is violated by ByteDance, TikTok, it gives the president authority, and it gives him authority to ban TikTok. And quite honestly, this is an authority that this administration, many of whom have asked us as Congress to give them, because they know they don't have the authority under case law. The prior administration tried to ban it 3 times. And this administration knows full well the dangers and risks of TikTok and what it poses to our children. And they've been very clear about it. Even today, we heard testimony to that fact. Again, we're providing a constitutional legal framework that the president can then sanction and act on this and ultimately ban if he deems it in the national security interest of the United States. I don't think that's dangerous at all. I think it's dangerous not to pass this bill. Because if we don't, and we allow TikTok to continue its surveillance in this country of Americans, and particularly our children, then we have not done our job on this committee. And I can't wait until CFIUS reaches an agreement. And again, this will give the president the authority to enforce it if it's violated. So with that, is there any further discussion on the amendment? There being no further discussion, the question now occurs on the amendment offered in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. Meeks. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed signify by saying no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, on that I ask for the yeas and nays.
A roll call vote has been requested pursuant to the chair's previous announcement. This vote will be postponed. Are there any further amendments?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Mr. Meeks is
Number
recognized.
11.
And, clerk shall report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 1153, offered by Mr. Meeks of New York. In Section 202F, strike vital to the national security interest and insert in the national interest.
Without objection, further reading of the amendment is dispensed with. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My second amendment is quite a simple one. It changes the waiver standard in the underlying bill to allow the administration additional flexibility. And I want to explain how I think about waivers going forward, as I am confident this issue will arise again during this Congress. First off, I do not believe we should be passing legislation without a waiver. The world is simply too unpredictable for Congress to sometimes permanently lock in the executive branch to sanctions policies. Because of a lack of a waiver, we have significant trade sanctions on some Central Asian countries that did not even exist as independent nations when the sanctions were imposed. We did not get rid of those Cold War relic sanctions on Ukraine fits-all template for sanctions. In some cases, a very high standard. Allies and partners have already imposed the sanctions contemplated by the legislation. In cases where economic considerations are at the forefront of the bill, as with H.R. 1153, which repeatedly refers to economic considerations, I think a national interest waiver is the correct standard. It does not make any sense to refuse to let the president even consider the fact that people could lose their jobs and their incomes or make foreign policy considerations like the importance of maintaining alliances. I encourage all members to support my amendment as it allows the president to consider issues we do not want him to factor in, that we do want him to factor in when making crucial sanctions decisions. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields. I oppose my good friend's amendment, primarily because it lowers the bar for waiver authority. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed signify by saying no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. And
Mr. Chairman.
The amendment's not agreed to. Mr. Meeks is recognized.
I ask for a roll call vote.
A roll call vote has been requested pursuant to the chair's previous announcement. This vote will be postponed. Are there any further amendments? What's her name? Ms. Dove is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have an amendment at the desk, number 17, and I just want to say as a new member of this committee how much I appreciate the decorum and the tenor of the chair. This amendment that is being passed out illustrates how American companies in my district with no real connection to the PRC's malign influence would become collateral.
If the gentle lady will pause and allow the clerk to distribute the amendment.
Absolutely.
And the clerk shall report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 1153, offered by Ms. Comlager Dove of California.
Without objection, further reading of the amendments dispensed with. The gentleman has for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This amendment illustrates how American companies in my district with no real connection to the PRC's malign influence would become collateral damage. In this case, an American video game company headquartered in my district, and it is Riot Games, and they actually make League of Legends. It's owned by a Chinese company, and it would be directly impacted despite the relationship posing no real national security threat. The bill's narrow exemptions would not protect this company or others like it, which is why I am submitting one that would do so. I think people's ability to innovate, design, and create should not become victim to a counterproductive, even though well-intentioned approach to how we deal with the PRC. I encourage my colleagues to support this amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Is there any further discussion on the amendment? Mr. Kane is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I oppose this amendment because it creates an unnecessary carve-out for a sanctioned company. It's important, as we're having these conversations, that we have a comprehensive approach that captures all aspects of a corporate entity that has the potential to threaten our national security. Thank you. I yield back to you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Any further? There being no further discussion, the question now occurs on the amendment offered by Ms. Dove. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed signify by saying no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. The gentlelady requests a recorded vote. Roll call vote has been requested pursuant to the chair's previous announcement. This vote will be postponed. Are there any further amendments? The clerk shall distribute the amendment.
The amendment is Manning number 4.
The clerk shall report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 1153, offered by Ms. Manning of North Carolina. Add at the end of Section 202.
Without objection, further reading of the amendments dispensed with. The gentlelady, Ms. Manning, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I offer my common sense amendment to H.R. 1153 to protect American companies, including those in North Carolina, from the unintended consequences of being exposed to sanctions if they happen to have foreign investors as minority shareholders. Mr. Chairman, we can agree that we should take concrete action to address serious threats to national security, data privacy, and cybersecurity. However, I'm concerned that without sufficient safeguards, sanctions in this bill could be applied not just to companies in Europe and in Asia, but also to penalize transactions by American companies if they happen to have foreign minority shareholders, which, by definition, have a non-controlling interest in a company. This bill, as written, could expose some of the most successful homegrown American tech startups, including companies with multi-billion-dollar valuations, which support thousands of American jobs, like Epic Games in North Carolina. Sanctions could be imposed under this bill, even though there's nothing to suggest that these American companies pose a national security risk. We should go after bad actors in a smart and targeted way without unnecessarily hurting ourselves or costing our constituents good jobs. That's why my amendment clarifies that this bill would not permit competition with China, that we can't afford to pass overly broad or self-defeating policies that would harm our alliances or damage free enterprise, which are the source of our competitive advantage. We need thoughtful policies that accomplish our specific goals without inflicting damage on our own economy. And that's why I urge my colleagues to join with me in supporting my amendment, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I oppose this amendment because it creates an unnecessary exemption. We do not have a full understanding of the intent and consequences of this amendment and have seen how the PRC can manipulate various levels of ownership of companies to influence decision-making. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Any any other members seek recognition on this amendment? There being no further discussion, the question now occurs on the amendment offered by Ms. Manning. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed signify by saying no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. Chair, I ask for a recorded vote.
A roll call vote has been requested pursuant to the chair's previous announcement. This vote will be postponed. Are there any further amendments? Ms. Jacobs is recognized. The clerk shall distribute the amendment. And the clerk shall report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 1153, offered by Ms. Jacobs of California. Strike paragraph 6, section 201A.
Without objection, further reading of the amendments dispensed with. The gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment strikes a provision that imposes incredibly broad secondaries with our allies are. We've seen firsthand how our ability to build international coalitions has directly protected our national security interests, and that means being a good partner and ally. Sanctioning our partner and allies' largest companies like this bill would require us to do is a formula to end alliances, not bolster them. The provision my amendment would strike also would apply to developing countries which, as we heard from administration officials today, often explicitly state that they do not want to choose between the United States and China. If we force them to do so, we may not like the choices they make given the PRC's broad investments around the globe, and we could risk losing them as partners altogether. The regulatory burden imposed by this provision on the U.S. government to enforce such sanctions would be unprecedented. This is particularly alarming given that the bill explicitly refuses to authorize a penny for broader enforcement. This provision is a formula for weakening our alliances, downgrading America's standing in the developing world, and closing off America from the countries around the globe. We should strike it, and I encourage all my colleagues to support this amendment to do that.
Gentlelady yields back. I oppose this amendment. Do any members seek recognition on this amendment? Mr. Baird is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I oppose this amendment because it undermines the criteria for sanctionable activity. Entities assisting companies that are threats to the national security should be subject to the same enforcement actions, including sanctions. And for these reasons, I oppose.
Aye.
All those opposed signify by saying no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment's not agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, I request a recorded vote.
Roll call vote has been requested. Pursuant to the chair's previous announcement, this vote will be postponed. Are there any further amendments?
Mr. Chair,
Mr. Phillips is recognized.
I have an amendment at the desk, Phillips number 11, please.
Clerk shall distribute the amendment. The clerk shall report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 1153, offered by Mr. Phillips of Minnesota. Strike Section 101.
Without objection, for the reading of the amendments dispensed with, the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And first, let me thank you for bringing this to the Foreign Affairs Committee. I just wish that this institution and this country was talking more about how to protect children and adults, all Americans, as it relates to their personal data and the algorithms that are indeed corrupting so many around the world. Unfortunately, this is, in my estimation, somewhat limited, and we should be having a broader conversation. As it relates to the specific legislation, sadly, I do feel there are too many flaws, but I want to focus my amendment on one of the most sacred principles that we hold in America, and that is freedom of speech. My amendment would strike Section 101, which aims to severely change the Berman Amendment and drastically limit freedom of speech. The Berman Amendment to IEPA was established to protect Americans' First Amendment principles. This amendment took away the President's authority to regulate or ban imports of informational materials like films and photographs and other forms of media from adversarial countries, since such authority would restrict free speech protections. Since its implementation, the Berman Amendment has been used to ensure that dissidents all around the globe can sell protest art, books, and films to Americans in the United States. Thus, it would be counter our values to ban a platform for free speech, be it one from China, from any other country, or frankly, one domestically. And that's why I'm profoundly opposed to changing the Berman Amendment. TikTok's management of Americans' privacy data and its potential to be used by a foreign government to influence Americans and individuals and the activities of allied nations. It would also be irresponsible, in my estimation, to move forward without fully understanding the bill's consequences and implications. I believe we should seek out thoughtful, effective responses to the challenges of data privacy abuse, misinformation, particularly when it involves authoritarian governments such as China. But those responses should not come at the cost of Americans' freedom of speech and economic liberty. Unfortunately, I believe this bill does not represent such a measured approach. In fact, I call attention to a recent Bloomberg editorial on this subject. I quote verbatim, "Perhaps the most important reason to avoid a ban is that it would be a missed opportunity. With Congress keen to crack down on the app, President Biden's administration could ask Chinese leaders to come to the negotiating table. In exchange for forestalling a ban, it could ask for security concessions on TikTok, one of the country's few notable tech exports, and also press for better treatment of U.S. companies in China. It could even have tried to establish reasonable rules of the road for the digital economy, including online privacy, data security, market access, and much more. In fact, a process of this kind, peaceful, technical, and incredibly boring, is precisely the kind of thing the U.S. and China could use right now, at a moment otherwise simmering with tension and unpredictability. Instead, Congress seems to be choosing blunt force, so don't expect much progress. Thus, I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and with that, I yield the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. I oppose this amendment very succinctly. This is a clarification of the Berman Amendment, not a change to it. And it's central it gives the needed authority to the President to ban TikTok if in the national security interest of the United States. With respect to any negotiations with the CCP, this does not prohibit or put any restrictions on the President from having negotiations with a foreign adversary like Communist China, although I would offer my own editorial that I don't think a negotiation in good faith with the CCP on this issue would be very fruitful, but that's just my perhaps cynical view and opinion. And with that, is there any further discussion on the amendment? Mr. Baird is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I oppose this amendment because it weakens the criteria that could be used to sanction PRC companies that are trying to influence U.S. policies in favor of the PRC strategic objectives. We must have the necessary authority to act against PRC efforts and malign influence on U.S. policy.
Back. There being no further discussion. The question now occurs on the amendment offered by Mr. Phillips. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed signify by saying no. No.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment's not agreed to. Are there any further amendments?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk if we're not going to go vote.
Mr. Allrod is recognized.
It's Mr. Allred, Mr. Chairman.
Recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, I share many of your
Let me
concerns.
say before you begin, the clerk shall distribute the amendment. And the clerk shall report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 1153, offered by Mr. Allred.
Without objection, further reading of the amendment dispensed with. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I share many of the concerns that have been discussed here about TikTok, but I see the sanctions package here as overly broad and undercooked. I think it could have serious unintended side effects. And the broad brush approach advocated by this legislation could lead us to penalize TikTok, ByteDance, Tencent, and its affiliates, would also impact unrelated independent companies who just happen to be a subsidiary of TikTok's parent companies. Notably, the measure would have detrimental effects on our European allies' entertainment software industry. With the current introduced language, European video game companies who are affiliated or subsidiaries of Tencent would automatically be designated under Section 202, immediately placing companies out of business and even affect our own domestic operations in this space. What my amendment does is clarify that European entertainment software companies should be excluded from Section 202 sanctions. And if we wish to effectively curb Chinese influence, we need to be cognizant of our allies so they do not get negatively affected. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I'm opposed to this amendment. Do any members seek recognition on this amendment? Mr. James is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I oppose this amendment because it creates an unnecessary loophole for a subsidiary of a sanctioned company. We cannot support a half measure that allows a subsidiary of a sanctioned PRC company to escape from needed accountability. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there any further discussion on this amendment? There being no further discussion, the question now occurs on the amendment offered by Mr. Allred. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
You don't have to. You don't have to if you don't want to. All those opposed signify by saying no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment's not agreed to. The yeas and nays have been requested. And pursuant to Chair's previous announcement, the vote will be postponed. Are there any further amendments? Seeing no further amendments, we're going to take a short recess to vote and come back and entertain Mr. Meeks' final bill, and then we will vote on all the recorded votes. We stand in recess.